This video is sponsored by Envato Elements. Hey friends, Dylan Bates here, the Final Cut Bro. Today we are going to be making Synthwave using Apple Motion. First things first, go ahead and open up Motion. If you don't get the project browser, you can push Command Option N. From there, we are going to select the Motion project today, and we can leave our presets at whatever we like. Now, if you are using this for, say, a song or something, I'm going to recommend that you set this to the duration of the song. The first thing we want to dial in is our backdrop. So go ahead, go to your generators and locate the gradient. Drag that in, and now you can jump over to the inspector, go to your gradient options, and dial in the colors as you like. I'm going to kind of go for some retro colors, but you can do whatever you please. We'll go ahead and rename this group to be the background group. So now we've got our background dialed in. The next step is adding in our Synthwave Grid. So find the library, go back into your generators, and just under the gradient is the grid. We'll make sure we place that over the top of our background here. We'll go into our inspector settings and you'll find the BG width and BG height options. Let's set those to something like 500. I find that looks pretty good for what we're trying to create here. What we want is for this object to actually be in 3D space. So to achieve that effect, go ahead, select under the group settings. There's this button here. If you click that, it will set this object to a 3D object. Now we can go over to our properties, find the rotation properties, and we're going to rotate this along the x-axis. We're just going to click that and type in 90 so that it is perfectly 90 degrees flat. After that, we can go into our position settings and drag along the y parameter to get it down to the bottom of the screen. I find that -450 is pretty good for what we want. After that, let's jump into the generator settings. Now, what we want is for this grid to be extending way off into the distance. So to achieve this, let's go ahead and find our height option, which is going to affect the length of our grid. So we'll set this to something like 20,000. Like so. So now it should be going off into the distance, and we'll get it to work even better in just a bit. We'll set our width options here in just a moment. What we're going to do is first add in a camera. So click Add Object and select a camera. What's great about the camera is we can set our angle of view to whatever we like. So I'm actually going to set the angle of view to something like 150. So you'll see that this is now extending our grid way off into the distance. Now you'll see that our render is not doing very good. We can't see many of our grid lines. So to fix that, we'll go up to our render options and set it to best. Now this is definitely going to be much more computer intensive, so just keep that in mind. Now it looks like we don't have a grid space right here, and I definitely want one, so we'll just drag down our number back to that 150. After that, go back to your grid options and we can drag out the width to whatever we like, and I like to drag it out to a point where we actually see the white edge there. And then I'm going to select auto fit just to get it nice and clean. So we now have a white edge along our grid here. So you might expect that we're going to animate the camera forward and backward over this grid. But the problem with that is that you're going to have to keep adding to the grid, and that's just going to keep adding to the processing power, slowing down your computer and making things more difficult. So what we're actually going to do is animate the grid. If you select your grid, you can come on down here to the offset options, and you'll notice if I animate along the Y offset, everything is moving forward and backward. So click this down arrow to get your individual options here. We'll find the Y value, click this down arrow, add a parameter behavior, and set it to rate. Rate is going to allow us to have this push forward at a consistent amount, thus tricking us into thinking that it's actually moving in 3D space. So we'll set this to something very low. You'll see if I set it to 1 pixel, it's actually going very fast. And you can dial this according to your taste, but I'm going to set it to something like 0.05, and now this has got a nice motion to it. So now that we have the grid here, we want to add in some color. Now you definitely have some options here. You can set your line color or your background color. And if you want, you can dial the opacity down so that the background doesn't exist. But what I'm going to do is actually go up to our filters, go to color, we're going to gradient colorize. And this is going to be really nice. You can actually see it already kind of working. The stuff way off in the distance has got this darker gradient to it. So if we jump into our gradient options here, we can actually set this to a different type of gradient. So let's say I do something like icy blue. So now our gradient has this really cool dark blue off in the distance, and everything near the camera is light blue. And we can actually dial this into taste. So if I want the distance to be red, which is what I want to kind of get that retro vibe, I can do that, and I can make the stuff close to us maybe a darker blue. And then we can dial in the dark background to be a really dark color, just barely visible blue, just like so. So we now have this colorized grid that looks really cool in my opinion. So that is pretty cool, but what I want is some more life to this grid. It seems a little lifeless to me, and I feel like we can make it look so much more 3D. So I'm gonna rename our grid group just to be grid. So to make this grid appear much more 3D and dynamic, what we can do is go on over to our library and locate the clouds generator. We'll drag that in. You can place it above or below everything however you want. And we're actually going to disable the 3D aspect by clicking that option there. You can disable the visibility so you don't have to look at it. Select our grid option here. We're going to right click and we're going to place it into a new group, and that's going to be our bump map group. Now for our clouds, I'm actually going to rename this to be bump map map. If that's not confusing, I don't know what is. And I'll rename it to bump map driver. There we go. That's a little bit more easy to understand. What we're going to do is select our bump map group, go up to filters, we'll go down to distortion, and we're going to select, you guessed it, bump map. Now we'll go back into our inspector and we're going to drag our bump map driver into this group. So now you can see it's already warping our grid in really, really cool ways. So what I want to do is actually animate the bump map to move at the same rate as the grid. So what we're going to do is select our bump map driver. We're going to find the offset options here. We'll click that and we'll find the Y value. We'll click add a parameter behavior. Now you could select rate and set it manually, but I'm actually going to select link so that if we ever want to animate the grid speed to be faster, we can do that. We'll drag in the grid option here. We'll find under the compatible parameters, we'll go to object, grid, offset, and Y. So now the same speed that the grid offset is moving is the same speed that our cloud offset is going to be moving. So you'll see that this just adds a lot more 3D to our grid. Now we can go back to our bump map driver and we can really dial in these settings. So you can make these grooves as deep or as shallow as you want. You'll definitely want some subtlety to it to make it not look too warped. You'll see if I push it too far, it'll actually get off the grid, and that just kind of ruins the effect we're going for. So now what we can do is I actually want to animate these bumps to the music. So if we jump into the bump map settings, you'll see that I have this amount slider, and we can go really crazy with it one way or the other. So if I set this to 0, you'll see that it is completely flat. Now what we're going to do is find this amount setting. We'll click this down arrow, add a parameter behavior, and select audio. Now I'm going to bring in a song from our sponsor Envato Elements. So I'll push Command I and I'll bring in this full track, which is called the Synthwave. You'll see I have this green line which indicates the music track is now in our clip. So what I can do is go on over to the audio value here and we'll click this arrow, full track, and you'll see it's already warping just like so. So it's definitely too strong and warping our mesh a little bit too much. Let's find our peaks and we're going to change that over to smooth, and then we're going to set our scale options to something like 0.1, and let's see how that looks. You can see it's working a little bit here. Let's go ahead and maybe dial that into 0.2. Now I actually kind of want it to go vertically up, so I'm going to set it from add over to subtract. So now it'll be actually growing rather than shrinking. And to me, that's already looking a lot more dynamic and really, really visually interesting. So now it's time to dial in the retro look. Go ahead, select your background gradient, and the first thing we want to do is apply a noise filter to it. So we'll go on up to our filters, we'll go down to stylize and select add noise. Now this is definitely a little bit too colorful for my taste, but we can drag down the amount just like so, and you could definitely leave it to have the different color variations in the noise, but I'm going to set it to monochrome just out of personal preference, and I'm going to change it from white noise over to Gaussian noise. I tend to prefer the look of that. So now we've got some noise in our sky in the backdrop, already giving us a little bit more of a retro look. The next step will be creating the retro sun, which I will tell you about right after I tell you about this video's sponsor. Envato Elements is changing the game with their incredible subscription service. They offer unlimited access to over 55 million assets. I don't know if you realize how large of a number that is. It is ginormous. They offer fonts, photos, stock footage, music, sound effects, WordPress themes, Final Cut Pro, and Motion 5 templates. They offer a super simple license, and your license still counts even after your subscription has ended. If you follow the link in the description, you will get 50% off when selecting the annual subscription. Do yourself a favor, my friends, level up your video editing library and get Envato Elements today. The next thing we want to do is add in our sun, which you'll see on these other retro suns. They have these lines here. So to do that, go ahead, disable your grid, and we could even disable the background just so we can really get a clear idea of what we're creating. We'll select under our shapes the circle shape. We'll click and drag and hold shift so that it's a perfect circle. Go ahead, disable your outline. Go into your properties and reset the parameters so it's directly in the center. Now what we want is for this circle to have those lines, and I'm actually going to drag this underneath the grid here, and we're going to call this the sun group. And we'll call this the sun base. So to get these lines, we could manually create masks and stuff if you wanted to, but I feel like that's a little bit tedious. Oh, and you'll notice that I put the sun in the middle. We don't want that. So select your sun base and we'll push I so that it's there for the entire video. So what we're going to do to create these lines is go ahead, click this arrow and select a rectangle. Click and drag to set the rectangle to about the width that you want. Go into your shape settings and disable the outline so that we have some really clean hard cut edges. And you'll want to make sure that this rectangle is definitely wider than the width of the circle. After that, select your rectangle and select replicate. This is going to give us a replicator, which is perfect. Now we have it under tile fill, but what we want, we'll select rectangle, we'll actually go to line. So now this is going to be creating everything over a line. Let's set both of these values to 0 here because we want it to be going vertically. So now we can, over the Y value, drag this up to the top. We're actually going to fully encompass the circle, just like so. Now what we can do is dial in our amount of points here as much as we want, and here is where the magic happens. Select your sun base, push Command-Shift-M, or you can right-click and add an image mask. Now you can select that image mask and drag in your replicator, and you'll see that our sun now has these lines just like the retro artwork. But something you'll notice is that the lines tend to get a little bit thinner towards the top. So select your replicator and you'll find this option here for scale end. If we select that, we can actually drag that up and you'll see that these lines at the bottom are thinner than the lines at the top. And I actually want to flop this. I should have done this first. So to flop it, we're actually going to go up here to the top, select the 437, set that to negative, actually we'll just do 440, and we'll set this to positive 150. Just like so, and then you can drag it accordingly to whatever you need. So now you can see at the top they are thinner slits, and at the bottom they're a lot thicker. So what we can do is continue to dial this in with this scale end, and then we could also go to our rectangle, go to our geometry settings, find our height options, and dial these in according to whatever we want. So we can make these a lot thinner if we wanted to, go back to our replicator options, and just continue to dial this in according to taste. I'll just drag this top part a little bit higher, just like so. So we now have our sun. Now I definitely want this sun to shine. So go ahead, select your sun group, go on up to your filters, go to glow, and we are going to set this as neon. And it's already glowing like crazy. So now what we can do from here is dial in our outer brightness and set our inner glow and get these looking as good as we can. Now what we want to do is actually give our sun a nice gradient. So let's go ahead and set our sun base. We'll go over to the style settings and you'll see this fill mode. Change it from color over to gradient. And already you can see the gradient happening here. Click this, and for me, I selected this, and I actually really liked how the dawn orange looked. Now I want to actually flip this gradient, so we'll go over to our gradient options here, and to flip it really quick, we'll just change the end to be 100 and the start to be negative 100, just like so. So now it's getting brighter at the top and darker at the bottom. Now we can re-enable our grid, which is perfect, and we could even raise the height on this a little bit. We could select our sun group, actually, that's a better bet, and get this to the proper height that we like. And we could also enable our backdrop. So you can see we now have our really cool sunshine with our backdrop. And what we want to do is actually make our sun look a little bit more retro. So go ahead, select your sun group, go over to your filters, and select under Stylize Bad TV. And it's throwing it up in the sky because it has this roll option, so change that to 0. And so now it's got this bad TV look, looking pretty retro. And we could dial down the waviness to taste however you want it to be. One last thing to make this look a little bit more retro is I like to select the bump map group. I'm going to create one more group, otherwise that'll throw off the bump map. And then we will go into our filters and we will throw on the bad TV look one more time because I love me some bad TV. And we'll fix the roll by setting that to 0. So now that has got a nice retro look to it. So the last thing to do is to bring in some retro mountains. And once again, we go on over to Envato Elements. I downloaded this graphic pack here, which came as a Photoshop file that I was able to open up in Affinity Photo and export a PNG of just the mountains. So I'm going to push Command I and bring in those mountains. And just like that, they are in here in all their PNG glory. I'm going to right click, put them into a new group and drag that group out of our grid group here. And then we can move them up a little bit. And what I'm going to do is line up the horizon directly with the horizon of our grid, so it almost looks like it starts to warp into the mountains off into the distance. Then to color this, select your retro VHS mountains, and we'll go over to color, and we are going to do hue and saturation. And then I'm just going to bring these up so that the mountains actually match the red of the distant grid so that they look like distant mountains. And of course, that's again up to your personal taste. After that, select your mountains and we're just going to drop on some grain and bad TV effect actually, and we'll set that to roll and you should be set. If you enjoyed this tutorial, you might also really enjoy recreating MKBHD's intro using Apple Motion. Also, if you're a patron, you can download the project file for this right now. Thank you so much for watching and I can't wait to see you in the next one.